We're talking with Charles Marsala, who is in New Orleans. And the reason we're talking to Charles is because if you're following the news and you care about Western culture and American history, or if you have any sense of decency at all, you know about what I think is a criminal action in Memphis, Tennessee, where the city council, and Charles will fill us in on this, effectively sold a park for what was it, Charles? $1,000?
$1,000.
$1,000.
Yeah, and I think I Googled a nonprofit, Ken. I don't think they existed. I couldn't find them on the internet. So it's not like they sold it to the Boys and Girls Club or the Sierra Club. I think it's a nonprofit that was created specifically to buy the park.
Okay, so they sold the park, and the reason is obvious, but what is the reason? They sold it to do what?
Well, you know, Ken, I guess I do want to let people know if we have some interference here. I thought it best to come to you from Jackson Square, New Orleans. And I was here about 2 weeks ago on the Brian Kilmeade show talking about Andrew Jackson's monument. So I think that reinforces the situation we have nationwide, that Andrew Jackson here in New Orleans is at risk. But the back to your question about Memphis and what's going on is in Memphis, the city council got blocked. They have a state law. We tried to get that done in Louisiana that would trump a city from doing something. Alabama has a state law. So you saw what they did, which was very creative, is that they said, okay, the state says we can't take monuments down that are on land we own. So we'll sell the land and then we'll take the monument down. And then as I saw this afternoon, the state assembly has now come in and said to challenge this, but they quickly took it down in the middle of the night before the state assembly could meet to try to get an injunction on them. It shows the creativity.
Yeah, so what's going to happen? Is the city then going to buy the park back for $1,000 after they took down the monuments?
I believe in, and you know, obviously there's no transparency, which has been going on nationwide with this in Charlottesville as well. There's a report that came out about 10 days ago that the police chief wanted basically let the officers stand down to try to create a conflict. And we see this nationwide where the municipalities are playing games with it. I think here in Memphis, the situation is going to be that the city tries to form a joint cooperative with the nonprofit. And we've actually saw that happen in New Orleans with the monuments coming down, that the mayor transferred at least $250,000 and maybe as much as $500,000 of the city's money to a nonprofit called the Foundation for Louisiana to remove the monument. So we see these mayors trying to figure creative ways to get around state law to achieve their end goal, which is a bad way to be. If you're going to say that the objective, the means is not worth it. So however you get it done, that there's this passion that we've got to get these monuments done, we're right, and no matter what method we use is okay.
Okay, so what ostensibly, what is their purpose for taking down these monuments? Are they pretending that somehow it's, I don't know, it's detrimental to their city's growth or something, to prosperity? We know the racist angle, but that doesn't seem to be holding water. So are they using that like an excuse, like keep up with the times or something stupid like that?
Well, you know, the deal is they keep saying that these monuments are offensive and that they're holding back cities from progressing to where they need to be, and it needed to be done. And I was rewatching some of our mayor's speech, and he had one that was very famous that he gave May 19th. And that speech, he says that these monuments were the equivalent of burning a cross, that they were the same as the KKK symbols, and that the Daughters of the Confederacy did it to tell a false narrative. It really puts a lot on the women that put up these monuments and raise the money. And these women are the women that created Memorial Day by putting flowers on Union graves in 1866. They're the same women that today put wreaths this last week on the graves of Union soldiers in the South as part of Wreath Across America Day. So we see that the politicians, I think, are looking to take these spaces and dedicate them to other purposes. In New Orleans, we took Moynihan Airport, who had nothing to do with the Confederacy, and it's now renamed Louis Armstrong Airport. The idea is, I believe, which alarms me, like 1984, George Orwell, to rename everything and get rid of a large part of our past that doesn't benefit the current people in power.
Okay, so what you're saying is, and correct me if I'm using over-the-top term, but effectively what we're saying is, would you call it white genocide, Western culture genocide? And another question, Charles, is who are these people that are doing this? I mean, it seems to be a concerted effort. And if you've got a group of people who are working together in harmony, there's got to be some organization behind the scenes. Do you have any insight to that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and say it's the U.S. Mayor's Conference. I mean, our mayor here, Mitch Landrieu, is now president of the U.S. Mayor's Conference. And he had a conference here in August. And shortly after that conference, we saw Mayor de Blasio say that he wanted to take down Columbus Monument in New York City, and that all monuments of hate needed to be looked at. So from that end, I think we could say that it's the U.S. Mayor's Conference, which, I mean, to be blunt, is typically at this point mostly Democratic mayors. I mean, I was part of that conference as a Republican mayor, but the big city mayors are Democratic mayors. So they seemingly have an agenda, and that is for the next year, Mitch Landrieu's head of it, to say, why don't we clean up this? And Mitch has said frequently he's doing hard work and that this needs to be done, and we've got to drive into racism. So I think you see this being led by the Conference of Mayors.
So they're using racism as a pretext. You know, my thought, and I'll let you reflect on this, I've said this many, many times, if these people really cared about intolerance and racism and slavery and all those lame excuses that they're using to take down monuments, what they would be doing is trying to take down mosque. Because, you know, the Civil War has been over for, 160 years or whatever. Though today we're having a problem worldwide with slavery, but Muslims are the ones who are doing it. And it's like they just ignore that. The reason I say that, Charles, is because that excuse is just so stupid. It's so lame that we are anti-racist. We've got to tear down the monuments. We're anti-slavery, but when slavery is a serious problem, they just totally ignore it. So it's very disingenuous.
Well, and I agree with you, Ken. I've lobbied on 3 or 4 issues, and I'll add this. I've been talking to National Geographic, and they called me to see about interviewing me for a special that they're going to air in March, and then decided not to interview me, it seems. And the point I made to them was I think they were looking for the Charlottesville story, that it was neo-Nazis, and since I didn't match up to that, I didn't fit the narrative. But I argued that there are several monuments here in New Orleans. If we really want to focus on slavery, we're adding to the Jean Lafitte monument to the tune of $9 million here in New Orleans. And he was a slave pirate. He made $13,000 in 1813 as his first slavery offense, where he took 170 slaves out of the Caribbean and brought them into New Orleans and sold them for $170 a piece. Yet we honor him here. So there's nobody that said, hey, let's not do that to Jean Lafitte. We have other monuments here to segregationists that were Mayor Morrison in the 1950s kept segregation going despite Brown versus the Board of Education. So there's other monuments that we could have looked at to take down that we're keeping up. And yet there's monuments right after Reconstruction. The first black governor in the country was Pinchback of Louisiana. He's a Republican, and he was followed by C.C. Anton, another Republican lieutenant governor during that era. So there's no talk about can we build monuments to these men. There's more of a talk here of we're just going to focus on this Confederate issue, and where does it go? And I think to your point, we're seeing that slavery, I love to say that Robert E. Lee, his statement was phenomenal. Slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil. And we have modern day slavery in New Orleans. In America, they say it's maybe 60,000 juvenile girls a year that are involved in modern day slavery. And we've seen so much in Libya recently, with 9 cities being on CNN exposed for having slave markets. So yes, there is a disingenuous part here that we're not addressing modern day slavery, and we're only looking at these specific soldiers that if you look at them in their whole life experience, Lee had 36 years in the Union Army and then 4 in the Confederacy. Beauregard had fought in the Confederacy, and he had Union experience. He had civic experience in Louisiana, trying to unify the city and desegregate schools. So we're only looking at those 4 years. It doesn't make sense to this logic that they have. It seems like it's also to distract from current problems that we have in the large cities of America, which are, frankly to say, being run by Democratic mayors.
The way that I like to say that is if liberals were logical, they would not be liberals. There's something about, in order to be a liberal, you have to be illogical. You have to be irrational. Now, I don't know if these people really are crazy, but they're acting like it. But, okay, here's what the story says. This is National Public Radio, which is not a conservative website, obviously. But it says, finding a legal loophole, Memphis takes down its Confederate statues. The story goes on. TV here. Sorry, Ken, a friend just came by to say hello. Okay, you can bring him on if you want to.
I may do that in a minute, but for now, you can welcome to come back in a few minutes, Jimmy. I'll be here for about 20 minutes. Sorry about that, Ken. You never know you're going to run into a Jackson Square. Jimmy Delray is a gentleman out of St. Bernard, and he might be worthwhile to bring on in a few minutes.
Yeah, we'd like to hear what he has to say. It was a long time in the making, but when the statues of Confederate figures finally came down in Memphis, it was quick work. On Wednesday, the city sold 2 of its city parks. One with a statue of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, the other feature of a statue of General Nathan Bedford Forrest on horseback for $1,000 each. What I think we're seeing here, Charles, and I'll let you reflect on this, is a precedent that if they get away with this, they're going to use that same lame excuse, racism, slavery, whatever, to go after national monuments. And you mentioned earlier Christopher Columbus, I think, was it in New York City or was it in Baltimore? Maybe both.
New York, maybe both, yes.
And they're going to use this as well, they already are using it as a pretext. So let's go over, we're going to cover some of the same things we talked about before, but basically the same reason. Okay, so we understand why they want the Confederate monuments to come down. Basically, in my opinion, it's Western culture genocide, white genocide. Okay, so the question is, would you say that's the same reason that they want to attack our national symbols? I mean, we can roll this into the NFL thing as well. There's something about nationalism. These people, well, to them, nationalism is anathema, so apparently they're globalists. So we're seeing...
You know, Ken, I'll go ahead and interrupt here. It's, on May Day in New Orleans, and we have this, and I want to give my YouTube channel a plug because we have about 80 videos there, and we have this video up that on May 1st was May Day. That's Karl Marx Day. And May 1st...
Before you go on, what is the link to your, how can I
it's Save Nola Heritage. I'll hold up. I have a little T-shirt here, so if somebody's just reading it, if we have a photo here, you can see there the image of Save Nola Heritage. It's got Andrew Jackson Monument, which is on the other side of me here, and that's our Facebook page, website, and YouTube channel.
Okay, I've got your website on the screen. Super.
Okay. So, Ken, what we have is on May Day, there was it was violence, and it's similar to what happened in Charlottesville. So I had a personal experience, and I was hoping that this National Geographic people would use my experience, because Charlottesville, as came out in the last 10 days, the police were not proactive with trying to stop that violence. So the police chief has resigned. And in New Orleans, on the 29th of April, which was a Saturday, I actually was out there, called the police department and said, why aren't you here? Because it's looking like there's going to be violence tonight. And the 911 operator said, well, we're not going to respond till there is. And I said, who's making that shot? I said, you know, because I was a former mayor. Are you being directed higher up to not respond, to make it difficult to cause a scene, or what's going on? And then I quickly had someone interrupt and say, we're going to send someone out right away. But they never barricaded and separated the groups. So they let them on May 1st just confront each other. It was a recipe for disaster. So May 1st, I ran into that just before the violence started. There was a huge banner, I say huge, 6 foot by 8 foot, of the Antifa crowd that had the Rothschild family crest on it. And when we started researching that, the Rothschild family funded Karl Marx. So I have to argue right now that I believe a lot of what we're seeing here is part of this Marxism theory, which was mentioned earlier about cultural genocide, to just erase history so that we're all even, and there really isn't an identity that the individual has. And we've seen that portray out throughout the other cities. And they mainly go under the name Antifa, but the reality is they're Marx.
Yeah, by the way, this is a little bit off topic, but did you know that Walmart is actually selling Antifa t-shirts?
I did hear that. I mean,
you can go to Walmart's website and buy one.
It's mind-boggling to see what we have going on right now. But you look back at the last couple of years in our country, and there has been a strong movement to socialism, which is related into Marxism, so that the concept of taken away from the individual is, I think, the objective here, and the means is again, I think that most of the mayors feel like our mayor has articulated, that they were elected to do the hard work, and rather than put some of these things up to a vote. And Ken, last year I ran for Senate, and I ran, one of my 10 planks of my platform was, we need a federal policy on this, because monuments on federal land are protected. If we had these monuments to these Confederate soldiers in 1957, they were given U.S. military veteran status. And there's a beautiful park on the river, Mississippi River, outside of Vicksburg, that is dedicated to Louisiana soldiers that died up there trying to defend Vicksburg from Grant when he was coming down with battleships. Here, if it's on city land, the government doesn't have a policy. And in St. Louis, their city council has an ordinance that says if you take down a monument, you have to give it back to the group that donated it. It's not like here in New Orleans where you can sell it off to whoever you want and write a bid that says it's restricted enough so that maybe only your campaign donors qualify. So there's these ways we're seeing cities like Memphis or Charlottesville or New Orleans, the monuments are down, and now it's been 2.5 years with no plan on what to do with them. It's amazing to see how aggressive mayors are being to take down monuments to get to these means.
Which raises an interesting question. What's being done on the federal level? Now, I've heard some rhetoric come from Donald Trump. Is there anything there other than just talk? Or can they do anything, first of all? And number two, if they can, is there anything being done?
You know, to my knowledge, no. And to know and note, yeah, it's two questions there. I think Donald Trump is going to be in a hard spot because, any rhetoric that he comes out with, and I think what he said at Charlottesville was very measured and correct, because here in New Orleans, we had a lot of, as Charles Lincoln, who's on to this call, will be talking later, he's got a PhD. We had Dr. Marksbury with a PhD. We had a lot of citizens show up at the very beginning with just a candlelight visual about the monuments before they came down. And one of them was holding a sign that said, "America, wake up, Marxism is here." There wasn't the scene where there was no neo-Nazis there and all that. So we've seen the media want to look to that. And again, the fact that National Geographic doesn't want to hear what I have to say or show it in their broadcast, as it appears now, shows that there isn't a desire to tell that part of the story. It's mainly to say that we've got to squash racism. And when Trump came out and said anything, they're going to spin that he is a racist, and not trying to say, well, you know what, they're, like you said, good people on both sides. There are people who are anti-Marxist that are saying don't take the monuments down. And I do want to interject something here. I didn't really know much about these monuments. And mainly all of them say is that there was a Confederacy. And if you think about it, the Civil War was not a civil war. The Civil War was a war for Southern independence, much like we have in Catalonia right now in Spain. It's not a civil war like in Syria. So the North wrote textbooks calling it a civil war. And then these people became traitors, whereas really they thought that the Constitution allowed them the right to succeed. So when the monuments went up, there's no text that says whites are better, this or that. It just simply said there was a Confederacy. We weren't traitors. We thought we were justified in pushing a point. And now, like Nathan Bedford, I've always heard he's called the founder of the KKK. I'm thinking when that first came out in Memphis, I'm thinking, well, maybe there's a valid point there to take down this monument because it is a symbol and it needs to come down. But last night I read about him, and actually he was kind of tricked into joining the KKK. And then if you read it, as soon as he figured out what was going on, he made a motion to dissolve it. And then he gave a speech that he would go after strongly anybody that was attacking blacks. And he became his process from Civil War veteran to where he ended up is a story that should be told. And consequently, I look at maybe these monuments that went up were actually to people like we see here with Beauregard, who after the Civil War fought for equal rights and desegregation. They were people that the war ended, and they worked to heal the country. But they don't want that story told.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a monument to Harry Byrd. Isn't that his name? Senator from West Virginia, who was a member of the Klan.
It definitely was Byrd. I don't know the first name is I'm skipping right now, but I think you're right. And I think there is a monument to him, or I think there's one going up somewhere. And I know that there is stuff dedicated to him. I was researching that recently. So that is interesting to bring that up. You know, and I don't really see monuments in New Orleans that are to people that were later on became, well, actually Mayor Morrison, though, that monument was erected in the 70s, and he was a segregationist. So I don't know why they're leaving that one up, but you're right. How do they pick and choose what stories to tell?
His name is Robert Byrd, by the way. Where did I get
Robert?
Harry from?
Yes.
Who was here? Anyhow, Robert Byrd, yeah. So he was a Klans member. There's probably some monument plaque, something to him somewhere. Nobody seems to care because, well, he's a Democrat, liberal Democrat. Yeah. Right. Now, I remember seeing an image somewhere, Charles, of a plaque engraving that I think it had the terms white supremacist or white supremacy on it.
Correct. You're right. And Ken, an interesting story there is that Mayor Walmsley in 1932 put that on the monument here. The monument was erected in 1891. And I'm sorry, what?
That was added later.
It was added 41 years after the monument went up. And the monument was actually designed in 1874. It took them 17 years to raise the funds. So Walmsley, an interesting story there at a parallel, is that was an era where the KKK was very strong. And they were actually very influential in the Democratic Party. There's talk of the Klan Bake of 1924 following the New York Democratic Convention, that they had 20,000 Klansmen come to that, and they went over to New Jersey and had a Klan Bake, they call it. 8 years later, Mayor Walmsley puts that very racist plaque up, and the next year he gets elected president of the U.S. Conferences of Mayors, which I go back to where we are now. The Mayor's Conference has a lot of power. So he was perhaps put that plaque up for national aspirations. And it was in September 23 of 1931 that plaque went up.
Was this guy a Democrat?
He was a Democrat.
All right. So white supremacy was put there by the Democrats. You know, the Harry Byrd, Robert Byrd types.
Correct. It was.
Totally obscured.
It is. And, you know, there's a street here in New Orleans named Walmsley. So throughout this whole process, nobody said, should we take that street name down? I'm mind-boggled that the focus is on just the Confederates, which were Democrats as well. And again, my argument here is researching this. When Louisiana voted to succeed, 47% of the state voted for delegates that were opposed to secession. So that only passed 53 to 47. And if you read about Virginia, the first vote in Virginia was 70% or 65% opposed to secession. It wasn't until Lincoln decided that he was going to go through Virginia to get to South Carolina with 75,000 men that they said, you know what, we're not going to let you do that. And there's so much history that we're losing. Robert E. Lee, I think it was April 17th of 1861, told Lincoln he was not going to lead that army through Virginia. And then you go out 17 years later, 1878, the Passe Comitatus Act gets passed that then prevents a president from ordering someone to do what he was trying to get Lee to do. You can no longer send troops through one state to get to another one if you're the president without congressional approval. So what Lincoln did today Trump cannot order troops to do. And we saw that in Katrina here in New Orleans. The governor of Louisiana, when Katrina hit, would not allow President Bush to send in troops to start saving New Orleans. Bush had to wait till Kathleen Blanco gave him permission. So this whole history that's being lost under the guise of we need to, these guys were evil, is a shame, because we have so much history of our country that is being wiped out.
Yeah, but if they wipe out the monuments, then they wipe out the history and nobody's going to look at it. No one's going to do the research that you have done. Seems to me that's part of their mindset, part of their strategy. Let's just erase this whole thing so we can demonize these guys. Now, the problem is, from their perspective, obviously, the problem is as long as those monuments are up, people are going to stop and ask, why were these people honored? Why were they so respected?
And it's so true, Ken. And in fact, as I came here to Jackson Square to talk to you, and Andrew Jackson Monument's on the other side from where I am, the cathedral's behind me. This is where Jackson, when the British were coming, and by the way, that is the December 23rd is the day that the first skirmish happened of that war before the Battle of New Orleans, and the big battle was January 8th. So Jackson was here rounding up people to go, and he had 450 free men of color. And they actually erected a monument there in 1908 during the height of Jim Crow, giving credit to those free men of color that fought in that battle. And behind me is the monument to Jackson, and engraved on it, it says, "The Union must and shall be preserved." So if you saw that monument, you might ask, well, Jackson died in 1840, I believe. What the hell is that on there? Is that from the Civil War? Seems like that's a Civil War deal. In 1830, South Carolina tried to succeed and declared a tariff null and void. And we remember the Henry Clay now, and the Tariff of Abominations, and the Great Compromise. So you're right. When you walk by and you see that engraved, if a tour guide, and where I am, we haven't had a tour guide, a group come through here, but this is an area where people can learn so much about our country's history. And the French Quarter, they might ask these questions. And they're going to learn stuff that is important to know as an American, our history, because that'll allow us to move forward. And if we're looking at how did the Americans end slavery, and granted, that was not an easy process, but we still should be inspired to end modern day slavery in America and end slavery worldwide by looking at what we went through.
Back to the situation in Memphis, Tennessee, where they sold the park for $1,000 so they can take down the monuments, skirt the legal aspect, and then probably buy back the parks. In the meantime, do you know of any legal maneuvering that the good guys can do to put a stop to this, or reverse, or get the monuments back or something?
Well, the thing is what St. Louis did, and they, I think they've at least won one cause. And in St. Louis, I was researching this. I believe the situation now is the mayor had to call in the Daughters of the Confederacy, who had donated the money to that monument, and negotiate with them, because the deal is that they could show that they had raised the money to put it up, and that the mayor is not allowed to take the monuments and then figure out either privately who to transfer them to, a museum for full of context, or to put some type of bid that says they must be displayed in a civil rights museum like Jackson, Mississippi just opened up, because we've seen the Beauvoir Museum in Biloxi asked Mayor Landrieu for the monuments, which is a 52-acre museum for Jefferson Davis. That was where he lived at before he died, and they were denied. So it seems that mayors want to put them in places that they can be vilified, and we've seen that happen. Here we have 6,000 signatures on a petition. We have to get to 10,000 to force a vote. But it has been very difficult because they blocked this. When I was out in California, the law is you only have to be 100 feet away from a polling place to get signatures. Here, it's 600 feet. So they enforced that on us when we showed up, because we had 800 people sign the petition before we were run off. And as I read that, it makes it difficult for you to challenge the government, which is a way of overturning a city council decision by this petition process. So absence of a senator taking a position on a federal law and then dealing with being called a racist and everything else that's going to go with it. It's a very hard process. And even here, you know, my family came here from Sicily in 1910. So we got no skin in the game for the Civil War. I'm being called a racist and a bigot. And my grandfather was in the Knights of Columbus, which fought the KKK because they don't like Catholics. So, you know, anybody that tries to do something is going to be up against a lot of opposition.
Okay, we're down to 3 minutes. I want to ask you about this segment that you did on Fox News. What was that all about? I actually have the video on the screen while you're talking. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
The Fox News segment, the gentleman came down and interviewed Frank Stewart, who is a businessman who's in the memorials. And Frank taught me a lot. He's 82 years old. Mr. Stewart has spent his lifetime in the mausoleum business, in the cemetery business, and his dad was in it before him. And he articulated how important it is that graves be honored. And if you look at the Robert Lee Monument and most of these monuments are actually to all the men that died. And we've seen that in Rhode Island. There's a monument in Rhode Island to the Confederates that died there, that they were fighting for a cause they believed in. They weren't fighting for slavery or anything that was evil. They fought. And here we had they call them the Louisiana Tigers, and that or Lee's Tigers. Now it's the LSU Fighting Tigers, the mascot of our college. And these men, none of them owned slaves, and they were fighting because they saw the North as invading their state, and they were protecting their families from an invasion, which again goes to the Posse Comitas Act, which is what Brian Kilmeade's book talks about, the miracle of New Orleans and the desire to take down the Andrew Jackson Monument. There's a conference in March from the Take 'em Down Nola group. It's a national conference. It just shows you how large this movement is growing. And in Memphis, the group is called Take 'em Down 901. So we're probably going to see a national organization called Take 'em Down, and with sub-chapters. And that interview for us was why Jackson should stay.
Okay, and the next thing that we're going to see, as we mentioned earlier, is Take 'em Down is going to take down the American flag. We could talk about the NFL thing, but we really don't have time. And, you know, all kinds of things that have to do with patriotism and nationalism. People want to get a hold of you and Charles Marsala. How do they do that?
What, Ken?
If somebody wants to contact you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, you know, like I said, we have a website, a Facebook page, Save Nola Heritage. We also have the YouTube channel. We get emails through there. info@savenolaheritage.org is our email address if they want to reach out to us. And, you know, I would say also that the deal is to be ready to take legal action. I want to say there was a group here called the Monumental Task Committee and 3 Louisiana Heritage Associations that did file a suit against our city council saying that they were violating the city charter. And they held that up for about a year and a half. The monuments, they did a great job. So if anybody is trying to do something, that would be a means to make sure their heritage organizations are in play, and they look through the ordinances. And I believe saying that a council violated the city charter is the strongest legal way to go.
Okay, so if you want to reach Charles Marsala, if you were with the media or whatever, go to savenolaheritage.org, send him an email, and he will get back with you. Charles, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Ken. Have a good evening.
Yeah, keep in touch.